I'm Barbara, 74 years old, and my son and his wife invited me out, but left me under the blazing summer sun after saying, "Just sit here for a while." 2 hours later, I was rushed to the hospital. In that moment, I made a vow. They will regret it. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about family betrayal and taking back your power. Trust me, what happened next will show you exactly how cruelty hides behind polite smiles. I spent most of my life working 12-hour shifts at a care facility that never paid enough but always expected more. And when I finally retired after decades of lifting others out of beds and wiping away messes that weren't mine, I thought I could finally spend time being part of my son's life instead of just financing it from the shadows. After my husband passed, I gave up the house we built together and moved into a smaller apartment to avoid being a burden, using the leftover money from the sale to help my son cover his wedding, his car payments, and a string of failed ventures he swore would succeed if he just had one more shot. When he called last week to say he and his wife Ava wanted to take me out to lunch, just us, I actually smiled like a child being invited to the grown-ups table for the first time, and I didn't question why they sounded unusually cheerful or why they emphasized how much they missed me when they usually went weeks without responding to my texts. I set my alarm an hour earlier than usual just to make sure I'd be on time, skipped breakfast in case the restaurant was fancy, and even took the longer bus route to avoid the station where I had to climb stairs, because I didn't want to show up looking tired or slow in front of the people I still considered family. When I got there 10 minutes early, no one had arrived yet, and I stood awkwardly near the edge of the meeting spot we'd agreed on, thinking maybe they were parking or grabbing coffee first, and I checked my phone twice just in case they'd messaged to change the location. By the time the clock passed the hour mark and my fingers were trembling from both the heat and confusion, I had called them 5 times each, left 2 voicemails, and sent a short message to their shared family group chat, but none of it was read, none of it was answered, and none of it made sense. I wasn't scared at first, just embarrassed, because I truly believed they must have forgotten or gotten the day mixed up, and even as my vision blurred and my body started to feel heavier than usual, I told myself I shouldn't make a fuss in case I was overreacting or making them feel guilty for something unintentional. But when I opened their social media and saw the time-stamped photo of them smiling at a long table surrounded by Ava's parents, clinking glasses and enjoying a full meal at a restaurant that wasn't anywhere near where they told me to meet them, my hands went cold and my heart stopped in the kind of stillness that doesn't come from shock but from clarity. They hadn't forgotten, they had lied. And the part that made my stomach twist wasn't just that they chose to spend time with her parents instead, but that they made sure I would be out of the way and unable to interrupt the perfect family photo they had just posted for everyone else to see. When I realized I had been left deliberately, not by accident but by design, I stood for another few minutes trying to understand if I had ever truly meant anything to them beyond a wallet and a babysitter who could be dismissed when no longer useful, and in that moment of dizzy realization, my knees gave out and I fell forward onto the pavement with enough force to split the skin on my chin open and bite down on my tongue. I don't remember the fall entirely, only that my vision narrowed and the pain in my head pulsed so violently I couldn't speak anymore, and as I reached for my phone to call for help, the screen was slippery and the heat made it hard to see the numbers clearly, but I still managed to dial emergency services with enough breath left to whisper my location before I passed out. The paramedics told me later that my blood pressure was dangerously low and my temperature was nearing levels they usually only see in heatstroke fatalities. And while they worked to stabilize me in the ambulance, they said the only reason I probably survived was because someone happened to walk by and saw me collapse near the parking lot barrier. I didn't cry when they told me this, and I didn't ask if my son had called them or if Ava had asked about me, because I already knew the answer before they even finished the report. And as I lay there under the fluorescent light with a needle in my arm and cold packs lining my back, I made a quiet promise to myself that this would be the last time I allowed anyone to forget that I was still alive. They did not check on me, they did not call the hospital, they did not even respond to the message I had sent them earlier asking where they were, and by the time I regained enough strength to sit up, A full day had passed and not one notification from either of them appeared on my phone. Not a question, not a word, not even a read receipt. That was the moment I stopped feeling hurt and started making decisions. Because betrayal is not something you wait to fix with apologies. It's something you mark, prepare for, and respond to with precision. They had erased me from their plans, so I decided to erase them from mine. When I got discharged from the hospital 2 days later with bruised arms from 4 lines and a warning to avoid heat exposure due to my age, I stepped into a silent apartment where the only calls I had received were from the hospital billing office and a neighbor who thought I had gone on vacation because she hadn't seen me in a while. And it hit me that not a single message, voicemail, or missed call from my own son had ever come through even after hearing I was hospitalized. I sat down without taking off my shoes and replayed the voicemail I'd left him before collapsing, my voice cracked and fading as I asked if they were on the way, knowing now that he must have heard it and still chosen to do nothing, because I had confirmed through another relative that they didn't return home early or cancel their plans that day. They simply pretended I didn't exist. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that weekend, not because I wanted to protect them, but because I needed time to think through every instance where I had allowed this same pattern to repeat itself under different excuses and different faces. Realizing that Ava had always resented the fact that I was involved in their lives without her permission, and that my son had started mirroring her distance the moment I stopped financially supporting them without hesitation. The lunch invitation that seemed so thoughtful had been nothing more than a decoy to clear me from their schedule so they could entertain her parents without explanation, and the longer I thought about how meticulously they had orchestrated the lie, including giving me a specific meeting spot and confirming the time the night before, the more I realized this wasn't a careless mistake, but a coordinated exclusion meant to humiliate me quietly. I remembered how I had offered to help with their mortgage a few years ago when they said the bank was giving them trouble, and how I had signed paperwork I barely understood just to make sure they wouldn't lose the home they now host Ava's family in while I sit alone counting coins to cover my medical bills. And I couldn't believe I had been so eager to feel included that I overlooked how little they actually respected me. They only ever reached out when something was due, when a bill was too high, when Ava needed time to herself and I was expected to babysit without warning. And every time I complied without complaint, I convinced myself it was love when it was really just obligation turned expectation, twisted into entitlement over the years. I thought back to their wedding, where they seated me at the furthest table and forgot to mention my name during speeches, and how I had told myself it was an oversight and not a sign, because I wanted so badly to believe that family was enough to excuse being invisible. But this time, there was no wedding speech to hide behind and no crowd to blame. It was just them and their decision to leave me waiting in silence. 3 days after being home, I received a text message from Ava that said she heard I wasn't feeling well, and hoped I was okay, with no mention of the abandoned lunch, no apology, no explanation, and not even a question about what had happened to me during the hours I sat exposed to temperatures that nearly stopped my heart. I didn't reply, not because I was being passive-aggressive, but because I finally understood that replying would give her the satisfaction of pretending nothing had happened. And I refused to be part of a performance where my pain could be dismissed with a casual emoji or a line of faux concern typed without effort. The next day, my son finally called, and though I didn't pick up, I watched his name flash on the screen 4 times before stopping, and I knew in my bones that the only reason he called was because someone else told him I had been hospitalized, not because he ever wondered why I hadn't followed up after the lunch. He left one voicemail, and in it, he didn't ask what hospital I went to or how long I had been admitted, but instead muttered that he hoped I was doing okay, and said things had just gotten a little hectic that day, as if being invited by your own child and then left to faint in the heat was the kind of inconvenience that could be shrugged off like a traffic jam. I didn't delete the voicemail immediately because I needed to hear it more than once to be sure that I wasn't imagining the indifference, and each time I played it back, his tone grew more unbearable, more detached, and more revealing of just how far I had fallen from being a mother to being a formality. When I finally sat down to make a list, not of complaints but of concrete facts, I included every transfer I ever made to him since he was 20, tuition support, wedding contributions, loan cosigns, cash envelopes on birthdays, emergency bailouts, car repairs, even furniture he never thanked me for. And the total was nearly the equivalent of what I earned in my final 10 years working double shifts while skipping meals to save. That night, I wrote down a sentence and underlined it 3 times. I have given more to them than I ever kept for myself. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't call a friend. I just made a list of everything I planned to change, and I highlighted the items I would address legally, because I was done using guilt to ask for what I deserved when contracts could say what my words no longer could. The next morning, I called the number of a law office I had used once before for my husband's estate and scheduled an appointment, not for advice, but for execution, because my decision was no longer up for debate. They had taken enough. I walked into the law office without hesitation, handed over my identification, and stated clearly that I needed to revise all beneficiary designations, withdraw any guarantees attached to outstanding property agreements, and ensure every financial tie with my son was either nullified or converted into enforceable debt with immediate legal effect, because I no longer trusted words or intentions from people who had already shown me how disposable I was when I wasn't serving their needs. As I reviewed my files and bank books with the attorney, I explained that the money I had transferred over the years was not a gift but support given under the assumption of mutual respect, and now that respect had been erased by deliberate abandonment, it was only fair that the financial contributions be treated as recoverable or documented to prevent future claims against my estate by people who couldn't even be bothered to ask if I had survived their neglect. I requested that we initiate the drafting of a new will immediately, excluding my son and his wife from any inheritance rights, and instead directed the assets to a charitable trust designed to assist elderly women abandoned by their families, because I wanted every yen they thought was theirs to serve as a reminder of what they threw away in exchange for shallow convenience. While the attorney prepared the documents, I dictated the language myself, making it clear that the changes were not due to confusion or pressure, but because I had full mental clarity and was choosing to sever emotional ties in the same way they had severed their moral obligations the moment they left me alone in a public lot to risk organ failure and permanent neurological damage. I ensured that my name was removed from the housing loan where I had once been listed as a guarantor without being told the full risk, because I discovered that if anything went wrong with their payments, I would be the one hounded by collectors, despite the fact that they hadn't spoken to me in months unless they needed free childcare or last-minute help for Ava's boutique events. The more the lawyer uncovered during our review, the more furious I became, not with them, but with myself, for allowing this kind of exploitation to pass as love, for teaching them that I would never say no, for reinforcing their belief that they could disappear whenever I was inconvenient and still come back expecting money and obedience as if nothing had happened. When the paperwork was complete, I signed every page with steady hands, and I told the lawyer to inform me the moment the registration updates were finalized so I could begin the next phase, which was to send a formal notice to my son that his access to my accounts and legal documents had been fully revoked and that any future contact would be filtered through legal counsel. The same day, I went home and collected every object in my apartment that I had kept out of sentiment for them, photos, cards, souvenirs from holidays they barely acknowledged I paid for, and placed them in a single box marked "Return," because I was done pretending that memories were more valuable than the truth of how they treated me when no one was watching. That evening, as if some twisted instinct had warned him, my son called again and left a longer message claiming he was sorry and wanted to come over to talk. But I didn't respond because nothing he could say would change the fact that he had gone out to lunch with Ava's parents and posted photos while I was slumped over asphalt, barely conscious and waiting for help that never came. The next morning, he showed up without warning and knocked for nearly 15 minutes before slipping a letter under my door that said he missed me and hoped I could forgive him because Ava hadn't meant to hurt me and they thought I was more independent than her parents, which only confirmed how warped their priorities had become, reducing my collapse to a misunderstanding instead of an act of cruelty disguised as oversight. I read the letter once, shredded it, and tossed the pieces in the trash, not because I was trying to erase the gesture but because I refused to accept apologies that were written only after legal ties were threatened, and I would not reward panic disguised as remorse with access to my money or my time. Later that week, I received an email from Ava herself with a long-winded explanation that their day had been unexpectedly stressful, and she hoped I didn't feel excluded. But what made me sick to my stomach wasn't her fake concern. It was the timestamp on the message, which proved she had waited 5 full days after my hospitalization before typing a single word that acknowledged I had almost died because of their choices. Every time I received another message, I documented it, forwarded it to the attorney, and added a note about the date, tone, and content, because I had learned that people like them would eventually try to rewrite the story and claim there had been a misunderstanding, and I refused to let this become another memory they twisted into something harmless. I prepared a final letter with my lawyer's help stating that I was no longer willing to participate in a relationship where my health, dignity, and financial contributions were treated as expendable, and that any future interaction would require mediation and legal accountability, because I knew they would only take me seriously if it came with consequences they could measure in documents and numbers. Once the letter was sent, I blocked their numbers, removed them from emergency contacts, and updated every account where their names appeared, including insurance policies, retirement funds, and my medical proxy, because I would rather trust a stranger with a clipboard than the son who left me to die for the convenience of brunch. I didn't tell them any of this directly, because they didn't deserve an explanation when they had never asked for one before making decisions that risked my life, and because silence was the only language they never tried to interrupt or talk over. They had made their choice, and now I was making mine, with finality, clarity, and not a trace of regret. 3 days after receiving the legal notice and having all financial access revoked, my son showed up uninvited with Ava by his side carrying a fruit basket and 2 forced smiles, pretending that everything could be fixed with a shallow performance of concern while completely ignoring the fact that I had nearly died because they decided I was less important than saving face in front of her family. I let them stand outside for several minutes before opening the door just wide enough to let them speak. Not because I intended to let them in, but because I wanted to hear exactly how far they were willing to go to twist the narrative in their favor, and as expected, they launched into rehearsed phrases about misunderstanding, miscommunication, and how Ava's parents had suddenly changed plans, all while deliberately avoiding the one fact that mattered, that they never checked if I made it home alive. When I finally let them into the apartment, I did so not out of kindness, but to ensure there would be no witnesses when I handed them the ledger I had compiled over 2 weeks, listing every yen I had ever given, every debt I had quietly covered, every document I had co-signed without question, and every instance where I had erased my own needs in order to ensure their comfort, and I laid it flat in front of them like an invoice for a lifetime of sacrifices they never even acknowledged. As they skimmed the pages with growing discomfort and shifting expressions, I watched them realize for the first time that I had been keeping track not to guilt them, but to protect myself from the moment I suspected they would one day try to rewrite history and pretend I had exaggerated my role in their rise. And their silence in that moment told me everything I needed to confirm that they had, in fact, believed I would never push back. I pointed directly to the column that totaled the wedding costs I covered after Ava insisted on a venue far beyond their means, and then to the down payment on their home that I transferred quietly from my retirement savings, and finally to the 3 instances where they asked for help with unexpected expenses, which I now knew were vacations disguised as emergencies, each request sent with urgency and received without gratitude. I could see Ava trying to formulate a justification, scanning the numbers as if some technicality would reduce the weight of what she saw, and my son shifting uncomfortably in his seat not because he disagreed with the facts, but because he never expected to see them laid out with such undeniable clarity, backed by bank statements and signed receipts he never imagined I had stored away. I informed them calmly that none of these transfers would be considered gifts anymore, and that legal steps were being taken to either recover the amounts or block them from claiming future rights to anything I owned, because they had broken the unspoken contract of care and reciprocity that binds a family, and I would no longer allow them to profit from my silence or loyalty. When Ava tried to suggest that the situation was being escalated unnecessarily, I reminded her that it was her decision to post photos online while I was unconscious in a parking lot that escalated the situation, and that the delay in contacting me after the incident confirmed she saw no urgency in the condition of a woman who had once sacrificed her own surgery schedule to watch her child when no babysitter could be found. I listed every missed birthday, every ignored holiday invitation, and every last-minute cancellation with excuses that were never applied to Ava's parents, because they were always prioritized while I was treated like a leftover obligation to be scheduled around. And I emphasized that from now on, I would measure their sincerity not by apologies but by action, and I had seen enough inaction to know exactly where I stood. When my son finally attempted to speak, I cut him off not with volume but with precision, sliding across the table a printed email confirmation from the lawyer that my life insurance beneficiary had been changed, my medical power of attorney had been reassigned, and my will had been updated to include none of the people seated across from me, which made them visibly recoil as the finality of the situation began to sink in. I told them this was not a temporary decision made in anger but a permanent correction of a power imbalance that had existed for too long, where I gave everything and received nothing but excuses, forgetfulness, and condescension wrapped in forced affection during the rare moments they remembered I was still alive. As they began to plead in softer voices and more careful tones, I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and returned with a sealed envelope containing a formal withdrawal of my name from their mortgage, informing them that effective immediately, their payments and liabilities were solely theirs, and any further contact on the matter should be directed to the bank and not to me. Ava's face changed instantly, no longer polite but defensive, as if my refusal to underwrite her lifestyle had become a personal attack, and my son looked at me not as a mother but as an obstacle suddenly immune to manipulation, his entire posture shifting from apology to desperation when he realized I was no longer afraid to walk away without looking back. I ended the conversation by stating clearly that I would no longer be available for favors, financial assistance, emotional labor, or holiday invitations that served only to maintain appearances while excluding me from real belonging, and that if they wished to remain in contact, it would be on terms I defined, through methods I controlled, and without expectation of forgiveness or access to anything I had built on my own. They left without finishing the tea I had poured, the fruit basket untouched on the table, and the expressions on their faces no longer smug or dismissive but stunned, as if the ground had shifted and they were only just realizing that the woman they thought would never say no had drawn a line they could no longer cross. The door closed behind them without a word, and I locked it not just out of habit but out of necessity, because I had finally accepted that protecting my peace meant closing the door on anyone who confused kindness with weakness. 2 days after I handed them the envelope and exposed every hidden debt they never expected to be held accountable for, I received a call from the mortgage officer at the bank who informed me that my name had successfully been removed from the co-signature, but that my son had attempted to contact them separately claiming I had been coerced into signing the withdrawal and was potentially being influenced by outside parties, which immediately told me they were now trying to reverse what they once begged me to agree to when they were desperate and I was too naive to say no. Instead of owning the consequences of their neglect, they had decided to attack my mental fitness in hopes that the bank would question the validity of my legal choices. And the moment I heard those words come from the mouth of a stranger rather than my own child, I realized just how willing they were to strip me of dignity if it meant salvaging their access to my finances. I responded by sending the bank a notarized statement from my attorney certifying my clarity and full capacity to make independent legal decisions, attaching a full medical report from the hospital dated after my discharge confirming that I had no cognitive impairments, and demanded that all further communications with or about me from my son or his wife be documented and forwarded to my lawyer immediately. The bank representative apologized for the situation and admitted privately that it was not the first time they had seen adult children attempt to override their parents' legal decisions by questioning their mental state, and while he didn't say it outright, I could hear in his voice that he understood the real reason behind the sudden concern, which had nothing to do with my well-being and everything to do with losing financial leverage. That same evening, I received a message from an old friend who mentioned that she had seen a vague post online from Ava suggesting that sometimes older relatives get confused and lash out when they're lonely, which was clearly an attempt to sway public opinion without naming me directly, And I knew immediately that they were beginning to lay the groundwork for a reputation smear in case anyone started asking why I was no longer visible in their carefully curated family content. They didn't care that I had once worked double shifts so my son could attend university without taking out loans, or that I had paid Ava's medical bills in secret because they didn't want her parents to know they were broke, and instead of reflecting on the damage they had caused, they were now trying to portray me as unstable to justify their loss of control. I contacted my lawyer again and instructed them to send a cease and desist letter to both of them stating that any further public insinuation, defamatory suggestion, or private accusation regarding my health, judgment, or behavior would result in legal action, because I refused to sit quietly while being erased from the narrative they were now actively rewriting to shield themselves from criticism. The letter was delivered by certified courier within 24 hours, and though I never received a direct response, the post was deleted within the hour and replaced with a photo of Ava holding her mother's hand at brunch, followed by a caption about cherishing the ones who truly show up, which was not only another indirect jab but a clear sign that they were still clinging to the illusion of having done nothing wrong. I printed that post, filed it in a folder labeled Insurance Against Revision, and added it to the growing collection of screenshots, receipts, and legal confirmations that I had begun assembling as a permanent record of how quickly those I loved most tried to destroy my credibility the moment I stopped giving freely and started setting boundaries they couldn't manipulate. The following weekend, my son's voice appeared on my voicemail again, this time trembling slightly as he said he never meant for things to go this far, and that he hoped I wasn't making decisions I would regret, which only confirmed that the only regret he was concerned about was losing access to assets he assumed were his by default, not the fact that his negligence had almost cost me my life. He didn't mention the hospital, the heat, the voicemail I left as I collapsed, or the fact that I had waited alone while they celebrated with people they saw as more worthy of their time, because in his mind, the real betrayal was not his abandonment but my refusal to continue rewarding it. The next day, I received a visit from a mutual acquaintance who told me that Ava had been calling around to people we both knew, subtly implying that I was acting out of character and might need help processing things, which was their newest tactic, painting my decisions as emotional rather than logical, even though every move I made had been backed by documentation, clarity, and months of preparation. I didn't respond to the whisper campaign or defend myself to anyone because I had no interest in winning approval from people who only knew one side of the story, and because I understood that the more I remained silent, the more transparent their desperation would become to anyone with basic discernment. Instead, I continued forward with my next set of plans, transferring the remaining balance of my investment accounts to a trust, redirecting the beneficiary from my son to a community foundation that provides housing for elderly women estranged from their families, and finalizing the paperwork that would ensure they had no legal standing to challenge the decisions after my passing. I instructed my lawyer to attach a written statement to the will explaining in explicit terms why the inheritance had been redirected, not out of malice but as a necessary act of justice in response to abandonment, and requested that it be read aloud upon my death to eliminate any ambiguity about what had occurred and who had made which choices. The more they tried to discredit me, the more determined I became to leave behind a record that could not be edited, deleted, or sanitized by those who had already shown a willingness to lie if it protected their image or income. By the time the documents were finalized and certified, I had created a complete barrier between myself and the people who once called me Mom only when it was convenient, and I knew without doubt that whatever narrative they tried to tell, the truth was already written, filed, and sealed where their influence could never reach. 2 weeks after I finalized the trust, removed their names from every legal document, and formally documented my decisions through notarized affidavits, my son appeared outside my building again with the same tired eyes and slouched posture that he always wore when he wanted something. Only this time he brought no gifts, no wife, no rehearsed lines, just a pitiful expression that made it clear he had finally realized the doors that were once always open to him had been bolted shut by his own choices and not by some temporary misunderstanding. I didn't open the door because nothing he could say would change the fact that he allowed his wife to mock me in front of others, let her silence my voice in family conversations, excluded me from gatherings while pretending to be too busy, and then had the audacity to call me unstable when I stopped subsidizing their lifestyle and dared to claim my autonomy. He sat outside long enough for my neighbor to ask if I wanted her to call someone, but I told her he wasn't dangerous, just desperate to undo a reality that he thought he could guilt his way out of, and I knew he wasn't going to leave until he realized that his apologies held no weight against the documented betrayal he had never even tried to deny. Later that night, he sent a final message begging to be allowed inside to talk, promising that he would do better, but the truth was that he didn't want reconciliation, he wanted reversal, and the only reason he used words like mom and family now was because the legal documents had made it clear that the time for pretending was over. The next morning, I printed his message and added it to the file labeled manipulations, because while it sounded remorseful on the surface, every sentence dripped with panic about what he was losing, not pain for what he had caused, and I refused to forget that when I was lying in a hospital bed on fluids and oxygen, he was posting wine glasses and brunch smiles like I never existed. Instead of replying, I called my attorney again and asked them to file a formal notice with the court confirming my sound mind and autonomous decision-making, because I suspected that Ava would soon attempt to challenge my trust documents by claiming I had been influenced or pressured, a tactic I had seen other families use when aging parents finally stood up for themselves after a lifetime of being treated as burdens. The lawyer confirmed that we could attach a psychological evaluation to the estate file, which I completed the following week without hesitation, answering every question with a kind of clarity that only comes from being burned enough times to stop romanticizing the people who hurt you, and I walked out of that evaluation with the full confidence that no court would ever believe I had acted irrationally. Meanwhile, Ava posted a new photo of herself with her parents smiling under lanterns at some event, the caption laced with phrases about how blood doesn't always mean family, and surround yourself with those who honor your worth. Which was laughable considering she was the one who had insisted I wait in a sun-baked parking lot like a disposable errand girl so she could avoid explaining to her parents that her mother-in-law existed. I printed that photo too, because every sentence she wrote was another nail in the coffin of their fabricated innocence, and I knew that one day they would try to convince someone, maybe even their future children, that I had turned bitter without reason, and I wanted the entire chain of their lies preserved for the day anyone decided to ask what really happened. When the official court-stamped confirmation arrived stating that I was of sound mind and fully capable of executing binding financial decisions, I made a copy and mailed it directly to their address with no note, no signature, just the seal and certification date, because I wanted them to feel in their bones that no matter what narrative they tried to spin, the state itself had already validated the truth of my choices. Days passed without any new messages, but then one evening I received a letter not from them, but from Ava's mother, who wrote with polished condescension that she hoped we could move past the misunderstanding and return to normalcy for the sake of family harmony, conveniently skipping over the fact that she was the reason I was excluded in the first place and had benefited from my erasure at every milestone, celebration, and decision point without once questioning why the person funding their lifestyle wasn't invited. She wrote that surely my son had made a mistake, but he was only human, and forgiveness was the highest virtue, as though nearly dying in a parking lot after being baited into isolation for their convenience was a minor lapse in judgment that I should overlook in exchange for rejoining a family that had already voted me off the island in silence. I filed her letter under witnesses to hypocrisy, and added a note for my lawyer to never accept mediation proposals or third-party interventions from any relatives or in-laws, because I was done negotiating with people who thought proximity to each other made up for the complete lack of accountability or remorse. I instructed my lawyer to include an additional clause in my will stating that if either my son or Ava attempted to challenge the document in court or contacted any of the named charities to question the terms of the trust, their names would be made public in the Foundation's donor letter, listing them explicitly as individuals disinherited due to elder neglect and medical endangerment, because I wanted their shame to be traceable and their silence to be a requirement for their own reputations. Survival. Weeks went by without hearing a word from either of them, which confirmed that once they knew the money was truly gone and the door permanently closed, they had no further interest in pretending we were family. And that realization, as painful as it could have been, brought with it the sharp clarity that I had wasted decades on people who only valued me when I was paying for something they needed. They never asked how I recovered, never checked if I was safe, never offered to cover the hospital costs they indirectly caused, and never once admitted in any form that what they did had crossed every line of decency, because in their world, my boundaries were the true offense, not the fact that they left me to collapse on hot pavement like a forgotten delivery. And still, I moved forward without them, every step cemented in paper, protected by law, and motivated by the memory of what it felt like to open my phone and see smiling faces on their timeline while my vision blurred and my chest clenched from dehydration and betrayal, both equally preventable. 3 months after the final legal documents had been executed and all ties severed with irrevocable authority, I received notice from a charity board member thanking me for the substantial trust contribution and confirming that the funds would be used to build a housing program for elderly women abandoned by their families. And as I read those words, I realized that the money once earmarked for people who left me gasping for air in silence would now serve women who had been erased in quieter, more permanent ways by the very people they raised. I had no intention of broadcasting what I'd done, because I wasn't interested in using my legacy to guilt anyone into behaving better. Instead, I focused on ensuring that not one yen I had earned through decades of labor would be spent by the same people who couldn't be bothered to dial a phone or open a car door while I lay shaking under the weight of their indifference. My son had not called in over 5 weeks. Ava had stopped posting vague insults online after the legal letter silenced her performative grief. And for the first time in years, I no longer woke up bracing for requests disguised as check-ins, last-minute favors dressed as visits, or holidays structured entirely around their convenience while I waited for a seat that was never set for me. Then, without warning, I received a letter from their family accountant, not addressed with warmth or familiarity but formatted like a business memo, asking if I would be willing to reconsider my withdrawal from the mortgage guarantee due to unforeseen financial strain on the household, which confirmed that now that the legal protections were solid, they had resorted to using professionals to beg on their behalf while preserving their own pride. I immediately forwarded the letter to my attorney and instructed them to respond with a copy of the official release document, along with a second attachment stating that any further attempts to solicit funds, reassume financial responsibility, or reverse revoked guarantees would be treated as financial harassment and pursued under fraud statutes, because I wanted them to understand that this was not a conversation. It was a finished chapter. The very next day, I received a handwritten letter from my son, filled with dramatic phrasing about sleepless nights and emotional wounds, but once again entirely void of acknowledgement for the actual event that started it all, the conscious decision to leave me waiting alone in high temperatures after they invited me out themselves, and not once in his rambling plea did he refer to that Sunday by name, which confirmed to me that even now, he wasn't sorry for what he did, only for what it cost him. He referred to my actions as drastic and permanent, clearly hoping I would flinch at the idea of finality, but what he failed to understand was that permanence was exactly the point, because temporary boundaries had always taught him that the door would eventually reopen if he just waited long enough for my loneliness to weaken my resolve. I didn't reply to his letter, but I scanned it, filed it, and added it to the folder titled Performances, because this wasn't the first time he had written words meant for redemption without ever offering repair, and I knew from past experience that every paragraph was a strategy, not a confession. Later that week, I heard from another mutual acquaintance, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, who told me that Ava had begun telling people I was manipulated by outsiders and coerced into cutting off contact, which made it clear that their new narrative wasn't just one of regret but of deflection, painting me as the vulnerable party who had been tricked into financial decisions I had documented across 5 meetings, 3 legal filings, and 2 notarized assessments. This tactic didn't surprise me, because people who rely on control always rebrand resistance as confusion, and since they could no longer reach my money or my name, Their only remaining option was to discredit the process itself and hope others would see me as a sad woman too angry to think straight. I responded not with confrontation but with escalation. I instructed my attorney to contact the real estate agency managing their property and submit a formal record confirming that my name had been fully withdrawn from all obligations, not as a courtesy but as a public notification to prevent them from claiming otherwise if financial collapse forced them into further manipulation. I also submitted an update to the local family services registry to flag my contact records and bar any emergency inquiries for my son or his wife unless routed through legal representatives, because I refused to be listed as a next of kin for people who had once scrolled past my last message while eating tiramisu and taking selfies with the woman Ava called Mom, while pretending I didn't exist. By this point, their silence had shifted from arrogance to fear, and I could feel it in the way they stopped trying to frame the story in public and started retreating into their curated lives, unsure how to proceed now that their usual tools, guilt, charm, misdirection, had been neutralized by proof, planning, and a mother who finally refused to be useful at the expense of being respected. I continued to live without their interruptions, without their conditional love, without their double standards where Ava's mother received phone calls, flowers, and front row seats while I was told to wait outside like an afterthought whose time had passed. And every single morning that I woke up without their names in my inbox felt like another page torn from the manual they used to control me. They no longer had access to my future, my finances, or my forgiveness, and the weight they once pressed into every aspect of my daily life had lifted, not because they had changed, but because I had finally stopped asking them to try. I used to think that blood meant something, that titles like son and daughter-in-law came with unspoken promises of care, reciprocity, and memory, but all they had ever meant in my case was unpaid debt, selective gratitude, and a permanent role as the person expected to give without limit and disappear without thanks. Now I had rewritten every clause, redirected every asset, removed every pathway they once used to reach into my home and heart without consent, and I did it not as revenge, but as correction, because the real punishment for people like them isn't your anger, it's your absence. 6 weeks after I dismantled every legal, financial, and emotional tie that once allowed my son and his wife to exploit my labor, my silence, and my savings without ever reciprocating with care, acknowledgement, or protection, I received a notice from the insurance agency stating that my son had attempted to submit an outdated beneficiary form using my forged signature in an effort to redirect a portion of my life insurance policy back into his name, which proved once and for all that his remorse had never been real and that every word he had written, every visit he had made, and every pause in his campaign of manipulation had simply been a waiting game for the right opportunity to reclaim control. The agent who flagged the attempt had recognized my name from the updated trust filing weeks earlier and contacted my attorney immediately to report the discrepancy. And while I was initially stunned by the shamelessness of the act, I quickly realized that this was simply the next logical step for someone who had already shown he was willing to question my mental state, rewrite the truth, and erase the consequences of nearly killing me with neglect just to preserve his access to the money I had earned alone. I instructed my lawyer to file a formal fraud alert with the insurance company, submit the forged document for handwriting analysis, and attach a cease and desist order barring my son or any of his affiliates from making further contact with any financial institution under my name, because at this point, it was no longer just betrayal, it was criminal desperation dressed in entitlement. The lawyer confirmed that we had more than enough documentation to pursue legal charges if I wished, but I chose instead to have the incident formally recorded and flagged in every legal system connected to my estate, because I wanted a permanent mark placed beside his name that could never be erased, one that would follow every future application, every background check, and every attempt to pretend that he was still someone trustworthy. This moment became the final confirmation that I had been raising, funding, and forgiving a man who no longer saw me as a parent, a person, or even a human being with rights, but as a passive gateway to resources he felt entitled to even after proving beyond doubt that he would rather let me collapse alone than cancel a lunch reservation with his wife's parents. He hadn't just let me down, He had left me behind on purpose, disappeared from my reality with calculated cruelty, and then returned only to salvage what he could from the wreckage he caused, hoping that my loneliness or guilt or age would dull the memory of lying in that parking lot with my mouth too dry to speak and my hands too weak to dial again. I printed the fraudulent document, highlighted the date, and added it to the growing file of documented violations, because I knew the day would come when he would once again try to pretend this had all been a misunderstanding, and I wanted the proof stacked, dated, and bulletproof for the moment someone dared to ask me why I walked away from my only child. A week later, I was notified that Ava had tried to enroll her mother in a senior healthcare plan using my former co-signature reference from years ago before I revoked all access. And when the system flagged my name as inactive, she allegedly told the staff that I had moved away and was unreachable, which not only confirmed that they were still using my name behind closed doors, but also revealed that their narrative now depended entirely on my erasure rather than my forgiveness. This wasn't just disrespect, it was identity theft dressed up as family responsibility, a grotesque continuation of the same game they had always played where I existed only when convenient, was remembered only when useful, and was discarded as soon as accountability entered the room. I filed a report with the agency in charge of the application process, attached proof of the revoked documents, and demanded a formal investigation into misuse of personal references without consent, making sure to include a written statement that I no longer authorized either individual to speak, sign, or apply in my name under any circumstances, and that any further attempt to do so would be escalated to the full extent of the law. No apology ever arrived, no retraction was sent, no phone call came from either of them explaining why they were still trying to use the reputation, trust, and credit I had built through years of unthanked sacrifice to leverage deals for people who once stood in front of my door and pretended that forgetting a lunch invitation wasn't the same as forgetting that I existed. They hadn't just failed to protect me, they had chosen to abandon me, then pretended that their silence was maturity, their inaction was misunderstanding, and their continued deceit was somehow rooted in love they were too ashamed to express. I reviewed the log of violations with my attorney, created a final affidavit summarizing every incident, financial, legal, digital, emotional, and filed it with my trust to be delivered to all relevant institutions upon my death, because I refused to allow a sanitized version of history to be read at my memorial by the same people who had written me off while I was still breathing. The affidavit included not just their names but their actions, their omissions, the messages they deleted, the calls they ignored, the documents they attempted to fake, and the timeline of every interaction since the day they asked me to wait, just for a moment in the heat, and I made sure it was written in language so clear that no one would ever be able to say, but maybe they didn't mean it. At this point, I no longer needed closure, communication, or acknowledgement. I needed only legal armor, institutional memory, and a future where no one could profit from the ashes they left behind when they set fire to our relationship and expected me to keep standing in the smoke, smiling for their audience. I requested a final clause be added to my life insurance that any individual who attempts to claim, challenge, or interfere with the policy without being listed as an authorized beneficiary would be immediately flagged and subject to investigation, and that their full names would be released to the foundation receiving the funds to ensure public transparency of those who attempted to disrupt donations intended for survivors of family abuse. When the paperwork was complete, I took a breath, not because I needed peace, but because I had finally ensured that every future attempt to take advantage of my name, my labor, or my legacy would meet a wall so reinforced with evidence and consequence that no manipulation, no phone call, and no crocodile tears could ever break through. 2 months after the forged documents were exposed, the fraudulent attempts blocked, and the entire chain of betrayal legally documented, I received a letter from my son's legal representative proposing a mediated meeting to clarify misunderstandings and rebuild trust. And although the wording was dressed in civility, it was immediately clear that what they wanted wasn't reconciliation but negotiation for damage control, because they had finally realized that the window for reclaiming any part of my estate was permanently closed, and they were now scrambling to minimize the social and financial fallout of their own actions. I instructed my attorney to draft a response stating that there would be no mediation, no discussion, and no emotional bargaining sessions disguised as legal meetings, because nothing they said could undo the fact that they had repeatedly chosen convenience over care, self-preservation over truth, and entitlement over accountability, all while I lay in a hospital room recovering from heat stroke induced by their calculated disappearance. The idea that they now wanted a meeting not to express remorse but to reframe their behavior as complex family dynamics was so grotesque that I requested a copy of every letter, email, and statement they had submitted to any third party since the beginning of the process, because I wanted to ensure they could never again try to rewrite the facts in a way that turned me into the villain of a story they authored through silence and selfishness. Their lawyer responded with sanitized language that deliberately avoided every incriminating detail, repeatedly referring to my recent decisions, as though they hadn't been preceded by a lifetime of one-sided giving, years of passive neglect, and one nearly fatal afternoon that neither of them acknowledged in full until they saw the inheritance slipping from their grasp. I had my attorney compile a formal dossier of their actions and submitted it to the foundation set to receive my assets, including timelines, screenshots, financial documents, and first-hand accounts of their behavior before, during, and after the abandonment, because I wanted the organizations benefiting from my trust to understand exactly why this gift came with names explicitly excluded from its blessings. Weeks later, I was informed that my son and his wife had attempted to file a motion questioning the mental validity of my decisions again, this time citing possible coercion from legal counsel or outside advisors. But the judge dismissed it immediately after reviewing the psychological evaluations, financial audits, and court-sealed documents I had proactively submitted months earlier, and while the attempt failed, it revealed that even now, they weren't trying to make things right but to regain control through obstruction and delay. I filed for a permanent legal injunction preventing either of them from initiating further legal action against my trust, my accounts, or my medical directives, because it was now evident that their goal wasn't justice or healing but to exhaust me through attrition until I broke under the weight of their persistence, and I wanted the courts to make it clear that this tactic would never succeed. I received confirmation that the injunction was granted and their right to file new motions related to my estate had been revoked indefinitely without leave of the court. And in that moment, I realized that the same people who couldn't find time to answer a phone call when I was on the verge of collapse had somehow found the time and energy to draft, file, and pursue multiple coordinated legal strategies, all aimed at restoring financial access to someone they left for dead. The hypocrisy was staggering. The cruelty so casual, and the sense of entitlement so deeply rooted that it became clear my silence in earlier years had trained them to believe that I would always bend to family pressure, always cave when the stakes were high enough, and always forgive if they just waited long enough for time to blur the harm. But this time had sharpened the memory instead of dulling it, and the longer I lived with the clarity of their betrayal, the more determined I became to ensure that not a single future decision they made could be backed by the resources I earned through decades of sacrifice that they neither understood nor respected. When the local notary public mailed back the final copy of my updated healthcare directive with the new emergency contact, someone completely unrelated to my family, I sent a certified copy to my primary care provider and hospital records department, because I would rather be treated by strangers who respected boundaries than risk waking up in a room where the same people who nearly killed me with neglect now pretended to care for optics. That same month, I was invited to speak at a private conference for estate planning professionals who wanted insight on elder financial abuse by adult children, and while I declined to speak in person, I submitted an anonymous case summary through my lawyer, outlining every detail of what had happened, how it had been concealed behind a mask of polite family behavior, and how legal preparation had allowed me to recover not only control of my assets but also my peace. The case summary was published under a pseudonym but quickly circulated among professionals as a template for how to preemptively block manipulative heirs from accessing aging relatives' funds, and though I never planned to go public, I took quiet satisfaction knowing that my pain would now serve as a firewall for other women who spent their lives building legacies only to be discarded once their usefulness expired. I also donated an additional sum to the foundation in honor of my late husband, whose name had also been quietly erased by our son over the years, left out of stories, ignored in family celebrations, and remembered only when invoking his name added legitimacy to their pleas for help, and I made sure his memory would live in stone rather than in selective memory. I received a thank you letter from the organization's board with a note that the new housing program would be named after a phrase I had once used in my statement, "Not forgotten, not for sale," and I authorized it with pride, because that was the truth I had carved out of Betrayal, the sentence that encapsulated every reason I chose dignity over tradition, silence over performative peace, and justice over reunion. They no longer called, no longer wrote, and no longer posted vague captions designed to provoke sympathy, because the courts, the banks, and the organizations now all had the same records I had kept in private for years. And even if they wanted to try again, there was nowhere left to run their narrative where the truth hadn't already arrived first. 1 year after the day I was left alone in a scorching parking lot by my son and his wife, who knowingly ignored my messages, watched the clock tick past our agreed time, and still chose not to show up or respond, I received a letter not handwritten, not personal, but printed, templated, and signed by a new legal firm representing them, requesting a reconsideration of my estate plan on the basis of reconciliation efforts, and claiming that sufficient time had passed to suggest healing could begin. And in that moment I understood that they had mistaken my silence not for finality, but for permission to try again. They believed that because I had not filed criminal charges, because I had not made a public statement using their names, and because I had not humiliated them in front of the same audience they once used to erase me, that I had left a door open, when in truth I had simply closed it so completely they had no idea how long it had been sealed. I forwarded the letter to my attorney without comment and instructed them to reject the request on every level, and to include with the response the notarized copy of the hospital discharge report, the time-stamped voicemail I left during the heat stroke, and a full transcript of the original post-AVA made while I lay unconscious and untreated, because I wanted every future legal team they hired to read the truth in writing before choosing to represent people who had only ever viewed my value through the lens of what they could take. I also asked my attorney to attach a formal declaration reaffirming the conditions of the trust, the terms of the will, and the permanent injunction filed against further challenges, making it clear that these protections were not made in haste but in response to a sustained pattern of emotional neglect, financial exploitation, and post-abandonment deceit, all of which were documented, certified, and preserved in formats no judge could dismiss. I added one final request to the file, that upon my death, if any individual listed in the restricted party section attempted to attend any service, memorial, or ceremony organized in my name, the Foundation administrators would be instructed to publicly read a letter written by me in advance, naming their actions, dates, and omissions, not out of vengeance, but to ensure that truth stood in the same room as any performative grief. I wanted them to know that this wasn't just about money, legacy, or property, but about the fact that for decades I had been a silent partner in their life stories, providing, funding, babysitting, filling gaps, solving crises, while they reshaped reality to make me invisible whenever my presence didn't serve their preferred audience. They never called when I got home from the hospital, never reimbursed a single bill from the ambulance ride or overnight stay, never asked which doctor treated me, never asked how close I came to permanent damage, and never even acknowledged the pain they caused directly, only alluded to it once they realized they'd gone too far to recover without legal consequences. I did not tell my friends about the final letter because I didn't need sympathy or validation anymore. I had turned every betrayal into documentation, every silence into a clause, and every apology that never came into a shield that now protected me from further intrusion, because when someone shows you what you mean to them in your most vulnerable hour, that truth cannot be undone by time or tears or tactics. They had spent a full year watching from a distance, never offering real remorse, only calculated steps timed to coincide with financial pressure or legal defeats, and they had only reached back out again once the final audit of the trust was completed and publicly recorded, which confirmed that they were watching my life not out of love but out of fear that their exclusion had become permanent. I had once loved them so deeply that I excused absence as busyness, minimized cruelty as stress, and tolerated being overlooked as generational difference. But once they made the choice to leave me sitting in silence, vulnerable to collapse, and too weak to call twice, the spell broke, and what remained was a timeline of facts no story could erase. Every institution now had the same version of reality, no contradictions, no gray areas, no alternate explanations. And even if they someday tried to tell someone that I was angry, confused, or unfair, the evidence would live longer than their lies, sealed in systems they could never touch. I had ensured that not one document could be challenged, not one claim could be reopened, not one attorney could walk into a courtroom on their behalf without being met with a record of decisions they made not in moments of stress but in patterns of disregard that only ever ended when they lost access to what they had taken for granted. I did not respond to the legal letter directly, did not speak their names out loud, did not spend a second considering the possibility that they had changed, because I knew that people who abandon you in your most fragile moment only learn two things from silence: whether they still have power, or whether they've finally lost it. And I made it absolutely clear that in this case, they had lost it, all of it, not just my wealth, not just my forgiveness, not just my presence, but any hope of being remembered as anything other than the reason I stopped believing family meant protection. They had spent so long assuming I would never act, never cut them off, never walk away, and now they were stunned by the fact that I hadn't just walked. I had run the other way, signed the papers, filed the motions, and placed legal landmines around every inch of the empire they once assumed was theirs. There would be no more letters, no more doors cracked open, no more moments where I pretended to consider their version of events, and no more hesitation between memory and action, because I had chosen justice over peace, dignity over legacy, and truth over tradition, and I would never look back again. I now live in a space untouched by the people who once used my name to elevate their comfort while lowering my worth, and I no longer answer phone calls that used to keep me tethered to a version of myself built entirely around silence, compliance, and a willingness to believe that proximity meant loyalty even when their behavior had made it clear that I was never more than a placeholder between emergencies. I stopped measuring time in holidays and birthdays that I spent waiting for invitations that never came, stopped looking at photographs they posted while pretending I didn't exist, and stopped wondering if the absence of apology meant they didn't understand what they had done, because everything that followed my collapse in that parking lot confirmed that they understood perfectly and simply believed I wouldn't do anything about it. Every document I signed, every account I closed, every beneficiary I changed, every trust one redirected, and every legal wall I built was not a reaction to a single moment of pain but a systematic dismantling of decades of imbalance, erasure, and unreciprocated sacrifice that I now saw with absolute clarity had been sustained not through love, but through the assumption that I would never leave. I no longer pretend to be confused about what happened, no longer fantasize about reconciliation, no longer feel shame for telling the truth about how quickly I was replaced, overlooked, and discarded by the people I thought I raised to understand compassion, because their actions taught me that the lesson they learned was never about care, it was about leverage, and how to maintain it at the expense of someone else's humanity. They had built an entire life with me as the uncredited investor, the free laborer, the on-call provider of everything from childcare to bailouts, and still they saw no contradiction in denying me a seat at the table they set for those who praised them more publicly, gifted them more grandly, or aligned better with the story they wanted to sell about who they were and where they came from. I wrote the final letter to my attorney instructing that upon my death, there would be no family viewing, no inheritance re-entry, no exceptions to the restrictions I placed, and that if they attempted to petition on the basis of grief, familiarity, or last-minute reflection, the estate executor would be legally required to publish the entire case timeline in any forum where the challenge was made, because I wanted truth to follow them as tightly as their betrayal once followed me. I now spend my time in places where no one asks what I used to be for others, only what I want to become for myself, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I am seen as someone complete without being connected to the needs of others, freed from the weight of being expected to endure in silence just to keep the illusion of family intact. I have learned that there is nothing cruel about boundaries, nothing selfish about withholding access from people who have already proven they see you as disposable, and nothing dishonorable about removing your name from lists, contracts, or histories where your presence was only ever used for benefit and never honored in return. I sleep better now that every document has been filed, every signature secured, every lawyer informed, and every exit made irreversible, because peace does not come from forgiveness forced before remorse. It comes from knowing that the cycle ends with you, and no one gets to rewrite the ending in your absence. And if one day, long after I'm gone, they tell someone that I was harsh, cold, or distant, I hope that person asks them just one question. Where were you when she waited? Because that question will outlive every version of their story, every excuse they craft, every omission they insert into the past, and it will remind them that there are some silences you never recover from, especially when they come from the person you left behind thinking she'd wait forever.